Well, good evening and welcome to the latest webinar from the virtual think tank jointly organised by the Institute of Economic Affairs and the Taxpayers Alliance. My name is Syed Kamall. I'm a Professor of Politics and International Relations at St Mary's University in Twickenham. I'm also the Academic and Research Director here at the Institute of Economic Affairs in London. This evening, we're grateful to the Rail Safety and Standards Board for sponsoring this webinar, where we'll be discussing whether our railways can get back on track post-COVID. And we've got a fantastic panel join us tonight. First of all, Mary Grant, CEO of Porterbrook, Chris Heaton-Harris, Member of Parliament for Daventry and Minister of State for Transport, Chris Loder, Member of Parliament for West Dorset, will be joining us very soon, and Mark Phillips, CEO of the Rail Safety and Standards Board. Just to let you know how it's going to work this evening, I'm going to give each speaker 3 minutes for opening remarks. And that should then take us up to about 6:20. Maybe I'll ask one or two questions before throwing it open to the audience for Q&A on YouTube. And that will take us up to about 6:55 when I'll have the summarizing remarks and then hopefully deliver you to your next Zoom or YouTube event or even supper by 7 o'clock. Now, if you have any questions, please submit them using the YouTube function and one of my onboard team will moderate and forward them to me. I'd prefer if you said who you are, but feel free to ask any questions anonymously. And just to assure our speakers, we've got people who will filter anything that may be inappropriate. I'm going to ask each speaker to switch the timer on their phone or their watch or whichever device they have to make sure that they arrive at the end of their verbal journey within 3 minutes. So why don't we start off, and the order we're going to do is I'm going to have to ask Chris Heaton-Harris first, then Chris Loder, then Mark Phillips, and then we're going to end with Mary Grant. So let's first of all turn to Chris Heaton-Harris, Member of Parliament for Daventry, Minister of State at the Department of Transport since July 2019, with responsibility for rail, cycling, walking and accessibility policy. Chris, give us your opening remarks.
Hi, Syed, and thank you very much indeed for the invitation, and thanks to the RSSB for sponsoring today's session. As you know, I'm a big fan of the IA, so long may it continue, and long may it give us positive and sensible market-led thoughts in the field of transport, which is a bit lacking in many spaces. Go on, you're going to say something, Syed, aren't you? No, good for that. Thank God for that. I just thought I'd answer the question by a simple yes. Rail has got an amazingly positive future going forward, but it needs to operate in a completely different way. As we know, as we've come out of, as we're hopefully coming out of the pandemic, and we'll be getting to a point where people will hopefully be returning to our railways. But will they? Will commuters want to come back to the services they had pre-COVID? In February, we did have our busiest ever month on the railways, but we dropped to 5% of our actual passenger numbers by the end of March. And people who used to commute, who used to provide most of the finances and revenues for the railway, have essentially found another way of doing their business. And so the railway does need to change. We need to change what we offer. We need to change our ticketing. Nobody wants to deal with cash anymore. Nobody wants to be holding pieces of paper. It needs to be completely reliable. It needs to be resilient, so it can, when something goes wrong, it can restart quicker. And it needs to reflect the market it operates in, and it needs to give the taxpayer some value, which the government has stood behind the railways in through the course of the pandemic, because they're vital to getting key workers to the right places at the right time, vital to getting freight up and down the country to maintain our strong supply chains. But the reason the future is bright, and I'll end on this with 30 seconds remaining, is that we have a whole host of things we want to deliver as a government. That's infrastructure, levelling up the country, and of course the decarbonisation agenda. So we have a much greener feel to our railways by the time we get to the end of this period of investment.
Oh, thank you, Chris, for very much on time. Now, just like buses, you wait ages for a Chris and then two turn up at once. And so let's now turn to Chris Loder, who before being elected MP for West Dorset, worked his way up from train guard at the age of 18 to working for the rail industry across the UK and Europe, including delivering the multi-million-pound upgrade at Waterloo Station. And given that I live in Surbiton, I'm personally grateful, as I'm sure millions of other commuters are. So, Chris, what about your opening 3 minutes?
Thank you, Syed. So, yeah, can the railways get back on track post-COVID? Yes, absolutely. But I think the railways need to change massively from where we are today and where we've been, because I think the changes in demand, changes in priorities of our passengers are going to be very much different. I mean, today we see, I think, passengers who prioritise whether or not the train is clean, whether the seats are comfortable for a longer period of time. How easy is it to get a ticket? Is it cheaper to travel by train than another mode of transport? Whereas previously, before COVID, it was, broadly speaking, as straightforward as saying, can we actually get on the train? Can we physically get on? Which was one of the reasons we did the Waterloo upgrade programme in 2017. So I think with those changes, and let's face it, we are seeing a considerable reduction of footfall. I mean, Waterloo during the peaks is roughly a quarter of what it once was before COVID. Commercial centres across the southwest and through my constituency, roughly you're looking at half, 50% of the footfall, and I suspect that's lower yielding footfall as well compared to what it was previously. So that means that we have to completely revisit really what the railway is about. What is the focus? I mean, for me, and understandably so, over the last 20 years, the emphasis has been on London and big commercial centres around the country and commuting into and out of those areas. I think that's going to change. I think the focus going forward needs to be much more about regional connectivity. I think it needs to be much more, for example, for me, I think that's much more about connecting Bournemouth with Exeter, for example, and there are many, many other examples along those lines. And I think with that reprioritisation also needs to bring with it a reconsideration of what we've traditionally called the franchise map. I don't think necessarily be franchises going forward, but maybe the rail operating business map going forward. And I think that will be very much in line with what Sir Peter Hendy has been tasked to do with the Union Connectivity Review. But I think we also need to give some real consideration to that, within England as well, and to how is it that, we've got one of the largest conurbations in Devon, which is Barnstaple, could so easily connect through to London, but that hasn't happened because the franchise map basically cuts that service in half at Exeter. That's just one example because I know it quite well, having lived and worked here for a while. But there are many, many other examples that I think that the government will have to really consider going forward now, to make sure that we bounce back, because the situation we're faced with today is not sustainable. It just is not sustainable. The cost is considerable, and we need to make sure that we bounce back or build back better, I think is the term, isn't it? There we are.
Well, thank you very much. You've also arrived on time. So let's now turn to our next panelist, who's Mark Phillips, who's CEO of the Rail Safety Standards Board, the sponsor for tonight's event, Deputy Chair of the British Transport Police Authority, and a member of the Transport for London Board. Mark has worked for British Rail, Railtrack, Network Rail, National Express, as well as for London Eastern Anglia. Mark, thank you very much for joining us this evening. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Syed, and it's great to be here tonight and on the panel. I think first, perhaps a few words about RSSB and what we've been doing, particularly in regard to the COVID pandemic at the moment. But RSSB was established after the Ladbroke Grove accident, which sadly was 21 years ago today, essentially to do three things. First, to run the industry standards, particularly to ensure interoperability between the different component parts of the system, whether it's rolling stock or the infrastructure and the train operations. Secondly, to provide industry with guidance on safety and particularly how it was performing from a safety perspective. And thirdly, to carry out industry research where there was a market failure, in the sense that there was no one party that would be particularly the beneficiary or necessarily be prepared to pay for it. So we fill that gap in terms of how the industry carries out its research. And then in this period of COVID, we've been working with industry to particularly help to, I think, primarily to restore, where we can, passenger confidence. And as Chris and Chris have both said, at the moment, for understandable reasons, the level of patronage is about 30% of what it would normally be and was prior to the pandemic striking. So there is an urgent need, particularly for those that have not travelled very much by rail, to actually start to improve that confidence. I think the second thing is looking at the sort of medium term. It's using this period to actually get the industry in a far better place. So when passengers do return, they experience a far better rail system than the one that they last used pre-COVID. So that means addressing ticketing and fares. So they're seen to be fair. They're more flexible, but the customer experience that you get is far better. That you're able to actually properly get a seat and you're not having to stand for prolonged periods of time, and that the passenger information is to a far higher standard. So in essence, we should be using this period to almost put the brown paper up at the windows and actually get the industry in a far better state so that when passengers do return, they get a much better experience. And then the third thing is actually thinking about longer term horizons. So in 10, 20, 30 years time, how we've actually decarbonised the rail system so that it is actually far more effective and better use of public transport than using car or rail as an alternative. Because remember, one of the big challenges we have is actually now the internet as a competitive threat, not just rail and car. And so we have to work particularly hard to retain those passengers in the future. But I'm sure we will. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Mark. And now to our final panelist, who is Mary Grant, the CEO of Porterbrook, has over 22 years' experience working in the UK and international transport sector, including roles at Eurostar, National Express, First Group, and ScotRail. Thank you very much for joining us this evening, Mary. Over to you.
Thank you, Syed, and great to be part of this panel. So, as a business that has been at the heart of Britain's railways for 25 years as an asset owner and manager, never seen anything like this. And to put that into context, you know, owning a third of Britain's passenger rail services, back in February, that would support around 1.5 million passenger journeys a day. So coming back to Chrissy's point earlier, you know, my goodness, things have changed, things that we couldn't have imagined. We've seen a lot, but nothing like this. However, nonetheless, what's really important as an asset owner, it's not just about financing trains that are required for different times within the network. And these are over a 30-year period. It's long-term operating services. What we're all about is also bringing in an engineering capability that can support whatever happens in industry, both to support what customers will need going forward. And this is going to be an interesting discussion over the next period of time about what will bring passengers back onto the network: reliability, safety, comfort, confidence, but also supporting government decarbonisation policy. And whilst we've had the challenges of what's happening from a passenger and revenue perspective, we've been working tirelessly behind the scenes, regardless of the restrictions around lockdown, and ensuring that our fleets are there and capable of supporting a rail network and a future customer demand, whatever that demand, whether through commuter, business and leisure traffic is going to be, it will be there. We don't have the road network to suddenly switch from rail back onto road, and neither should we. But equally, we've got a decarbonisation policy that says our future on electrification and alternative energy sources is something that we should be working on now. And having invested already 3 billion in new vehicles and looking to invest and continue to invest in new vehicles where required, but also in alternative energy sources, we see that as a critical part of supporting where we are at this pivotal time. For example, we launched the first hydrogen train in test onto mainline services last week. That was supported by Mark's team at RSSB and also supported by the industry and Network Rail. We couldn't do that without being a partnership. It's also really important that we support the supply chain. So we subcontract thousands and thousands of pieces of work out to thousands of UK workers, and that's a really important part of sustaining and supporting the economy to get back onto having a passenger service that people are confident in using, but also the economic supply chain support function behind the scenes that's equally as important to support the future of our railways. And the future is bright, and there's huge plans that we're hoping to support and be part of. So looking forward to taking part in the discussion.
Well, thank you very much. What I'm going to do is now throw open a couple of questions and probably start from an IEA perspective. Now, we're a classical liberal free market think tank. If you think about the period of private ownership before nationalisation, post-war nationalisation, what was allowed to happen was a sort of market discovery process. And when you saw the market discovery process, you had, if you like, you saw vertical integration as a result of that process. Now, fast forward to the late 90s and privatization, and in a way, when the railways were privatized, you kind of saw an artificial construction to give the semblance of competition. So rail track, 25 train operating companies, 3 freight rail operating companies, 3 rolling stock leasing companies, 13 infrastructure service companies, etc., etc. But we've never really allowed the sort of market discovery process to take place. Chris, let me start with you, Chris Heaton-Harris, as the minister, and please, I'll probably then ask Mary, given your perspective, and ask the others. Do you think we will allow, given what's been announced about the new franchising model, etc., do you think we will allow the market discovery process to take place, or do you think we'll still continue with this sort of artificial division?
To be frank, I think there's going to be a level of artificial division that will go into the future for quite some time. Simply because actually this probably isn't the bandwidth at this point in time to do something much more radical than the plans we have. The industry does struggle with this in a big way, and we actually lack diversity in just about every area in our industry, and thought is definitely one of them. But there's a big challenge here in the kind of, for a classical liberal think tank such as yours, as to, okay, if this model does not work, what is a proper classical liberal approach to our railways? Because you can't have a libertarian a kind of completely free for all railway. It needs to be organized in some way. You need to have safety levels at a certain level, because no one's going to travel on your product otherwise. But actually, we can do a lot more than we are doing at this point in time. And I think the job now is to maintain and encourage the current private investors in our market and try and encourage a few more new ones. But there will be a time where revenues are stable in rail, that we have a model that is kind of working and would have been working for a period of time, where we can look to new entrants, new ideas, disruptors even coming into our market. But I've got to say, I struggle to see that in the near term.
Mary, do you agree with Chris on that? It's too early. Do you think we'll ever see any sort of form of integration, or we'll carry on with these artificial divisions?
I think, yes, I do agree, but I think there's more entrance into the industry than possibly we might think. But the opportunity that we actually have in the next phase through the reforms of really how the railway should operate is actually maybe taking away some of the unnecessary complexity that's been created, that has actually, I think, given the passenger a diminished service than, say, 5, 6, 7 years ago. But notwithstanding, there's been enormous pressures of the demand of extra capacity and requirements and frequencies that have put enormous pressure onto a network that was carrying last year 1.7 billion passenger journeys throughout the year. But if you take my sector, for example, and the financing of the assets, there's over 15 different entities in this space now. There's not just 3. However, you've got to also know what you're doing in terms of how to bring them into the market and then look after them over a 30-year period, not just introduce them over a short period of time, because they have a longevity that if you're going to extract maximum value back to the passenger, to the taxpayer, and support the industry, you need to take that longer term view. So there's more people around looking at this sector, but inevitably it's going to have a period also of stability, I think, for it then to flourish and grow again going forward.
Okay, and let's see if Mark or Chris, given your experience. Mark, can I ask you?
Yes,
you've obviously got experience in the industry for many years. What's your view on my question?
So I think it's important to note that a lot of the industry is fully privatised and will remain so, particularly infrastructure projects. So if you're talking about new signalling systems, and as Mary has said, rolling stock manufacturers, that's all private entities that carry out that work. Whereas in the BR era, it was all part of the central function of British Rail. So that is fully private and remains so. I think the challenge that we're about to start to examine as part of the model for the future is the size of the concessions. And because one of the features, particularly in the very early stages when OPRAF let the franchises, was that in the main they were much, much smaller, and therefore probably attracted a larger number of entities that could, from a balance sheet point of view, withstand the risks from taking on some of those organisations. And in fact, there were a very few, but they did exist, management buyouts. So I think one of the pieces of work that undoubtedly will take place in the next period will be to start to do some work on optioneering around, well, who would be attracted to run these businesses in the future, and what's the right size, both from an operational point of view in terms of the service that it covers, but also in terms of the businesses that will be prepared to bid to run those concessions.
Okay, so Chris Lowe, you're a member of Parliament. You're a backbench MP. I know I was a politician. I've now got the liberty of being at a think tank. I can now sort of speak freely. But I deal in sort of ideas and and theories, and you have to explain this to all to your constituents. So when I ask a question about vertical integration, does it mean anything to your constituents? What are they looking for?
No, they don't really care whether it's integrated vertically, horizontally, or any other way. They just want the railway to work. I think in terms of your point about franchise market discovery, I entirely concur with my honourable friend when it comes to what we can do in the short to medium term, when it comes to revenue generation based on the current routes and journeys that we see. But one of the things that the current franchising system has really constrained is the ability to think cross-boundary. I'll just reiterate the point I made earlier on. We know that there is demand cross-franchise boundary, and that we do need to, I think, take this opportunity that's forthcoming in almost a revenue risk-free way for operators to test some of these markets and to think outside the box to ensure that actually where regional connectivity can be boosted, it is done so in the right way. I would also just go on to say that one of the things that concerns me with new rolling stock coming forward, and I mean that really from a prescription point of view, is that often the department, particularly with the GTR franchise, for example, or concession, should I say, there has been mandated 12-car fixed formation trains. The way we will get through this bumpy period in the coming months is for us to be agile, and that's not just in terms of our ability in respect of franchise and revenue and so on. It's agility in respect of resources. It's agility in respect of planning to better respond to the demand, because this process that we've had to go through, network rail planning process, is far too long for the situation we're faced with today. So I think, yes, we need to remove some of the revenue risks, but we need to enable operators to think outside of the box. We need to really reprioritize, because as I said earlier about how passengers decide, but I also think that we need to think of it from from an authority point of view. We've now got this sort of regional transport sort of body now, and we've got the Western Transport body that basically is between government and local authority, that wants to prescribe what what services in long term are available. I'm not sure that having this extra layer of bureaucracy in and around this process at this time is the right thing to do. And ultimately, coming back to your final point, Syed, actually, what do my constituents want, and what do the passengers want when they travel by train who live in West Dorset? They want to be able to get to where they want to get to, and they want a reasonable frequency, but their priorities have changed now. It's not just about the ability to get on a train like it once was. It's about, is it clean? Is it comfortable? These ironing board seats that we have, when the trains go through refurbishment, one of the things I hope that Brexit gives us an enormous opportunity is to escape, to get rid of get rid of these shackles that have tied us to EU regulations that mean we have to have seats that are like ironing boards, which passengers complain about bad backs when they want to travel to London. It'll allow, I think, a whole reprioritization, which will help the bounce back of passenger demand.
Well, thank you, Chris. And so Brexit's not only about blue passports, it's also about more comfortable seats on our trains. Great.
It's about removing the EU standards, the fourth and fifth railway packages that, frankly, have made the cost of our railway very expensive for a long period of time. So we'll get rid of those soon, I'm sure, won't we, Minister?
Well, Chris Heaton-Harris and I can remember the days of railway packages.
The fourth. Yeah, don't worry.
Okay, so let's now turn to some questions coming in from we believe in competition, so for a variety of channels coming in, some from YouTube, some from Twitter, etc. First question, and this probably plays to the point of accessibility. So I'm going to start with Mary, then Chris Heaton-Harris, and then ask the others to come in. Tom says the comment, "Can we physically get on the train?" is notable, perhaps for reasons other than intended. Pre-COVID, disabled people faced real barriers accessing the railways. How will this change? Mary, now you spoke about technology, you spoke about hydrogen trains. What about accessibility?
So accessibility has been a major part of a reform, as we know, for the last 20 years, where all train operators and the rules and regulations that were coming in place had to ensure that trains were compliant for persons of reduced mobility. But of course, it's not just physical disabilities, it's also hidden disabilities as well, and whole accessibility that we're now looking at as an industry. And I think we've taken that industry wide very seriously, whether it's at support at stations, whether it's now on board, in terms of facilities, information for look, feel and sensory. And I think that's a really important part that will continue to be very much prescribed in any future refurbishments or new builds as fleets are coming in to service the networks.
Okay, if you're watching on YouTube and you still haven't submitted a question, feel free to submit a question. We've got just under half an hour, so please feel free to submit more questions. Chris, what's your view? I mean, one of your roles you said earlier on is you are responsible for accessibility policy. How do you respond to that question?
Yeah, and back in the day, I was the chairman of the all-party group for learning disabilities, and I've been active in this particular field since the age of 16. And I've got to say, railway doesn't do this very well. We're investing quite a bit of money at the moment to make our stations more accessible, but we have 2,563 stations on our network. Lots of them built in Victorian times, and where these priorities just didn't even figure in the discussion at that point in time. So the capital spend required to bring them all up to modern day standard is extraordinary. Then you've got the rolling stock, and there are amazing things going on rolling stock. I was on a Statler train on Greater Anglian only a few weeks back, where who'd have thought you could have a small platform that comes out of the side of a train that means you can a disabled person can in a wheelchair can independently get on a train that's actually been designed by so it's got disabled access in the right places where they're on slightly longer journeys. It's by a member of staff who can also help you with any queries you might have, where you've got an audio visual display that is working properly. We are, as Mary said, as new rolling stock, we've had a lot of it in the last couple of years, comes on stream. These are step changes in the offer that we make to those that have these requirements, and it's also good for not just disabled folk, but for everybody, mums, prams, cyclists, you name it. It's good for everybody. So I say this is what we should be doing. It's a market-led response. This is a big sector which we need to tap into for revenue going forward. So there's a lot more to do, but I think the bigger piece, to be quite frank, is on the stations themselves, and that's a big job of work.
So I'm going to turn to the other Chris now. You do get many of your constituents writing to you, asking you about these accessibility issues?
I don't get many constituents writing about it, but when I worked in the industry, it was one of the kind of critical areas that were often often on the priority list. I think by and large for accessibility, it's not too bad at urban stations, particularly where there's a high footfall. And I think the real issue starts to come in when you drill into this and you recognise, or we recognise that actually it's those where those stations that have accessibility difficulties, or they don't have a bridge, or don't have a lift, or whatever, or no means to cross the line, um, where they don't have station staff, and often are in rural or semi-rural settings, that's where the real issue has been. I'm not saying there aren't issues in urban areas, but in terms of wider priorities, I find that's very much the case for rural areas, and it has been incredibly difficult for train operators who've wanted to get this right, but where it wasn't in their franchise agreement to do it, and then try to fix it. Then the business case for Network Rail and so on, there is there are some blockers in the bureaucracy to accessibility, and we should be able to sort them out. And particularly where we have done study after study after study, and consultation after consultation after consultation, we know where these difficulties are. We don't need Network Rail or any other organisation to do another study to tell us where they are, because we already know. We just need to get on and do it. And hopefully, I really hope one of the opportunities in the new operator arrangements going forward is that stations like Folkestone, not in my constituency but just to the east of Bournemouth, has been an issue that we've all known about for years and years and years, probably decades, but it's still an issue, and it's not really acceptable. We need to find ways of fixing it.
So, Mark, it says it in the title, Rail Safety and Standards Board, and how does that apply for greater accessibility?
I mean, the industry has done quite over the last decade or so, and Mary's highlighted particularly some of the improvements made to rolling stock, which are very important. But I think there are probably three areas that I would say we need to do more work on in the period ahead. The first is, I think it's really helpful to have the right representation at board level. And I see this at TfL, that we do have senior board level representation for accessibility impairment. And I think that does give you a very different way and perspective in terms of how you look at new investment projects and how the operation works, because people do see things through a different lens. And I think that's really helpful for the board to start to apply that thinking to its investment criteria. I think the other big area is particularly around when things don't go well in periods of disruption. So yes, the investment that we've been doing is great when the timetable is operating well and performance is good. But when things get disrupted, that's when it's really difficult for mobility impaired passengers. And I think we've got to invest a lot more in terms of information, so that passengers that are actually on a train, they know the best decision to make in the circumstances where their journey is disrupted, so that they can actually continue and complete their journey. And we're not good yet at providing that information. And I think secondly, we need to continue to train our staff to help mobility impaired passengers to a much higher and better degree than we do at the moment. Because if you are, again, disrupted in your journey, all too frequently, unfortunately, you get some very upsetting occasions where people are not treated with the appropriate attention that they need when their journey is disrupted and their mobility is impaired. And I think we've got to do a lot more in that area. So those would be my additional comments. Thanks.
Great. Well, we've got some more questions coming in. Let's start off with Isabella, who asks, how do you think that the climate change agenda, and in particular the UK's net zero targets, could affect the future of the rail industry? I'm going to throw this straight back to you, Mark, to start off with, and then I'll ask Mary, and then both Chris's.
Well, I think very sadly we've seen an all too real case study of how climate change is affecting the railway, with the tragic accident at Stonehaven a few weeks ago, where the driver, the guard, and the passenger sadly lost their life as a consequence of what would appear to be the impact of climate change and heavy rainfall on the earthworks surrounding the line. And obviously the Rail Accident Investigation Board are carrying out a very detailed assessment of what went on there. But I think we are starting to see the impact of climate change, particularly in low-lying areas in Anglia, where the seawater is starting regularly to raise river levels around some of the rail lines, and that's having a big impact. So a couple of years ago, RSSB did do some research into this. We've published a report and made a number of recommendations, particularly for the infrastructure manager, to attend to in terms of raising the height of some of the signalling systems so that it puts them out of danger of rising water, to start to think about the impact of hugely variable temperatures, very high in the summer and very low in the winter, particularly relating again to signalling and communication cables, and also to overhead power cables, which can change the tension during those different variants in temperature. And likewise with rolling stock, sometimes that can fail in very high temperatures. The ventilation systems can break down, and that leaves passengers in a very uncomfortable experience. So again, starting to put some technical mindset behind how we can better cope with those temperatures is going to be absolutely essential in the period ahead.
Now, Mary, in your opening remarks, you touched upon this and the challenge that how the industry is facing challenge. You talked about hydrogen chains, for example. Now's your chance to elaborate, if you like. How are you meeting the challenges, or how are you subscribing to the climate change agenda?
Well, as we've seen, the most effective and efficient long-term solution is electrification in key arterial routes throughout the UK. We know that. That's not going to happen overnight. There's a long-term plan in place. It's good to see that. But there's other forms of energy sources that can support, and also can support in the short and medium term as we get to this carbon zero target that we're all going to sign up to. And yeah, we've been working for the last couple of years with the University of Birmingham, so bringing in academia and business to how we can produce a mainline train with a hydrogen raft, and do that in a very safe and secure environment, and also be able to then bring it into service in a reliable way. We've just done that last week. It's now going to go back into test. But there's many other things that we can do as well, because today, only 48% of the network's electrified. So there's still a lot of diesel trains out on the network. And that is, sadly, we do need them, because it's about power, it's about speed, it's about freight. There isn't an immediate alternative overnight. But there's many solutions. There's things such as an after treatment, an exhaust after treatment. We're working with a company that can take 80 and 90% of CO2 and NOx emissions out of the air immediately with some very simple treatments. We're trialing that on passenger services, and we're looking at currently what we can do with our freight colleagues on locomotives. So there's a lot of things that we can do, as well as battery technology, so you can still support that last green mile into city centres that are highly polluted, and then also they're far more efficient, equivalent of a stage 5. So basically really reducing any forms of emissions. Clearly the long-term goal is zero emission, but in the short and medium term we can absolutely support, and we are, as I would say, being disruptors in that sort of alternative energy source space. But also I think the other important part is to recognise that when you create a fleet of trains, the equivalent of carbon that you're producing is substantial. The actual in-year maintenance is very small in comparison. Actually, it was one of Mark's studies a number of years ago. The equivalent of one vehicle would produce 146 tons of CO2 in that production. In the in-year equivalent of maintenance is 2.3 tons. So it's not the in-year life of the vehicle, it's the actual production. So making sure that we use assets and then refurbish them, repurpose them, and make sure that they're right for our customers is also ensuring that we're not creating an environment of excess emissions that we don't need to. So I think there's a whole host of things, but we can act now, and we are.
Chris Loder, you've obviously worked in industry, and clearly you've got constituents who are concerned about climate change. What perspective can you bring to this when someone asks, what's the industry doing about climate change agenda? Sorry, you're on mute, Chris.
I do beg your pardon. You can hear me now, I take
Yes.
it. Yeah, excellent. So I've got two key things about this. First of all, I think the industry has to be a bit careful that we don't go and use climate change as an excuse for, for some of the things that happen. Having aircon failing on trains, or trains break down because of hot weather, is nothing new. We've been having this for decades. Regrettably, we have also been seeing bank slips for some time, and I think there has to be a greater understanding of how change in vegetation management, for example, can contribute to some of those things. And I'm not saying for one moment that the situation at Stonehaven was as a result of this, but I think in the broader perspective, I think there has to be a real consideration. I think the industry has to be very careful not to use climate change as an excuse for not actually grasping the issues, operational or otherwise. However, I do think on the climate change front that the railway undersells itself massively as to how it contributes to the environment. The reality is that with the railway operating, even in the way it is today, it is a huge contributor to reducing the effect of pollution because, in effect, it's taking cars off the road. Now, admittedly, at the moment, demand is down because of COVID, but it's a huge makes a huge effect, and I don't think we sell that enough. And I also don't think that as an industry we sell the brilliant innovations that are happening enough. Some of the things that Mary's just articulated just now are amazing, absolutely fantastic. I would warmly encourage my friends in the DFT and ministers to shout about that much more. I mean, on the Transport Select Committee, we hear from the Climate Assembly, the assembly that is the collection of people from around the country that tell us great ideas and their thoughts and so on. You know, personally, I'm not a huge supporter of that principle of an assembly, but the things they tell us. The reality is that organisations such as Porterbrook are already exploring and innovating in the way that they are. So I think we need to shout much louder. We need to tell the entire nation, not just passengers, about some of the great things that we're doing. And I'm hoping that going forward, when we see these complicated models such as Moira and otherwise, these demand prediction models, that we will also be able to feature in those models the greenness, the environmental friendly aspect, and those key innovations, such as Mary has described, will be a big component in that.
Well, before I turn to the Minister, I know Mark wants to come back on that. So let me ask Mark to come back, and then I'll ask the Minister at the end.
Thanks, Syed. I just want to pick up on Chris's point. I don't think we are in any way saying it's an excuse about climate change. The absolute fact is that serious weather events are happening on a far more frequent basis. So the heavy deluge of rain, the rising sea levels and impacts on rivers, they are undoubtedly having a much bigger and much more expensive impact on infrastructure. And therefore, we are going to have to look in future control periods about putting more money and investment into the infrastructure to protect it from these weather events, and much more than perhaps we had envisaged historically. So it is a point of fact, and it's not something that we're just trying to hide behind as an operational issue.
Thank you, Chris Heaton-Harris. I'd like to think that we have government and we have joined up government. People are clearly thinking about climate change. Are we doing this in a joined up way? And how do you see the railway industry's contribution to this whole debate?
Yeah. Well, firstly, as a Conservative, I think it's fairly obvious that we all want to leave the planet in a better state than we found it. It's part of kind of core principle to conserve what we have and make it better. And the railway is playing a big part, and he's going to play a bigger part. Let me give you a handful of examples to to kind of correspond with what Mark and Mary and Chris have said. Firstly, I represent the Daventry as a constituency. In the heart of Daventry is Daventry International Rail Freight Terminal. It is a strategic rail freight terminal, and every train that goes into there takes between 44 and 46 lorries off of our roads. It's getting busier and busier and busier. It's a key part of our supply chain for the nation, and rail freight has a lot. There's so much positive stuff going on in rail freight, and yes, we do need to get the diesel engines changed or make them cleaner going forward. But getting those lorries off the road also doesn't just change the environment locally, but you're talking about air quality for us all. Then you've got, amazing research and development going on across the piece on this at the moment. This is where the private sector really does add tons of value to what we do. If you just have to look at what's going on in Mary took the Secretary of State grant to Evesham last week to see this hydrogen train go in action. You've got huge numbers of people coming forward with new technology in batteries, and batteries getting smaller and stronger, and they'll absolutely play a part in this. And then you've got and new technologies that we haven't even thought about will be breaking through as well. And then you've got this thing that actually the Department of Transport, through its arm's length agencies, does actually control a huge amount of land, and it's always been sat there as a bit of a pain, to be quite frank. And unless it's very close to the road or the rail, we've never really done much with it. And I think, and we are going to use that land much more efficiently and for offset purposes. So I actually think we can make rail a really big, sensible win in this area. As Chris says, it is already. We can do it a darn sight better and sing its praises from the rooftops.
Okay, so we've got just under 10 minutes left, and I've probably got to see if we can squeeze in a couple of questions. So I'm going to ask you all for brief responsive, if that's possible. So let's start off. Next question on HS2, and the question said: if passenger numbers are falling, can we really justify £100 billion plus on HS2? And that's from Emma on Twitter. And Chris Loder, I'm going to start with you as a backbench MP, and then I'm going to ask Mark, Mary, and then Chris Heaton-Harris. Chris Loder.
I used to be a great supporter of HS2. I thought it was an important thing to do, not because of speed, but because of capacity. However, capacity has changed a little bit. I, over recent months, or maybe last couple of years, become more skeptical on HS2, and I think now there is a question over the business case of it, given the developments that the person has just said. However, we didn't ought to underestimate the long-term benefit, the very long-term benefit of HS2. I know, I know there's a real concern about some of the direct environmental impacts now, but if we are serious about migrating from aviation to rail, which I think is commonly understood now to be the most environmentally friendly way of travelling, it is important to make it happen. I think it's also actually important to connect up the Channel Tunnel rail link to make it happen further afield as well. And as you can probably see in the background, just up there, that's a poster from 2010 when we brought an ice train into St Pancras. And I very much hope we'll be able to send trains from HS2 across to Europe to make that even better.
Okay, Mark.
I think it's probably quite difficult to make the business case in the current climate, and I almost think there's hardly any point in trying to do so. The fact is, we've made the decision. The work is taking place, and I think it is going to be a future of probably the next 100 years, and I'm sure it will be hugely utilised as the decades roll forward. Would we want to do without the Channel Tunnel and the HS1 link now? I don't think so. So I think we've just got to accept it's happening, and I'm sure it's going to be hugely productive for the country in the decades to come.
Mary, do you agree with what Mark said and with what Chris said? And what was your view?
I do, but the other point is, again, to say, we were talking earlier about taking freight off road and onto rail. This also is a capacity requirement for future freight connectivity up and down the country. So, quite right to say today, tomorrow, or even in the next 5 years, 10 years, it feels, could we have spent our money more wisely? This is a long-term strategic development that will support the economies far and wide, regionally and from end to end. And so, yes, I agree, and I do support HS2.
And now to the Minister. Is there really a business case for HS2?
I'm not the Minister for HS2, so I think I can.
Oh, good.
Yes, absolutely. If you want to build back better, you need, you need proper infrastructure for the country. The infrastructure is not for the next 2 years; it's for our lifetime and our kids' lifetime beyond. And that's an investment in this. If you want to get planes out of the sky, and we have got hundreds of domestic flights going about their business before pre-COVID, and there will be again unless we make alternative provision on our rails, and that's what we need to do. And as Mary says, absolutely. So my constituency is Daventry. To the south, 1.5 miles to the south of the border of my constituency is HS2. So in parts of my constituency, it's not very popular. The other part of my constituency sits on essentially the Northampton loop of the of the West Coast Main Line. We need capacity on that line for freight and for passenger services. It's bursting now, pretty much, or was bursting pre-COVID, and it will be back. So we need this capacity. HS2 was missold as it should never have been called high speed. We should have been talking to people sensibly about what they understand about capacity on their railways and the future of decarbonisation. And I think more people would have bought it had we done that.
And I know Chris wants to come back here. Chris.
Just very briefly, the one thing, though, despite what I've said, that we miss is the politics of this across the nation. The nation broadly believes that HS2 is a bit of a white elephant. And I think part of that is because they don't understand how HS2 itself benefits the economy across the nation, whether or not the line goes through it. So, for example, in my constituency of West Dorset, it is a hard sell at home because it's difficult for me to say to the constituents of West Dorset, it benefits you. And I don't mean the actual train or the train service, it's the wider economic benefits. How many jobs does it create? What are the specialist providers that come from West Dorset and other places that help to create HS2 and therefore help create jobs? I think that's the real thing that we need to drive and look into. And I think we will see a change in support for HS2 if we can articulate those messages much better.
Right, I've got one question I'm going to try and squeeze in, so I'm going to ask you to be very, very brief. It's probably an impossible task I'm asking you. Mike has asked, is it really possible to come up with a model that gives train operator entities greater control and responsibility over infrastructure? If so, how can it be done? Now, of course, we're not going to be able to answer, all four of you are going to answer that in 2 minutes. But are there any quick suggestions that I can ask? And Chris is rearing to go, so I'm going to ask Chris Loder to start and see who else wants to come in. Chris Loder.
So in answer to the question, yes, I do think it's possible. One of my former roles was the head of alliancing projects for the Deep Alliance of Southwest Trains and Network Rail. And we proved that it could be done. There were lots of pros and there were lots of cons to it. And, as was the case, it was equally proven that it wasn't sustainable in its current guise. But yes, it was possible. I feel that, the mid to long term, I completely agree with Chris about what he's had to say about the short to medium term of the railway and what we can and can't look at. But Brexit is an opportunity in this respect because of those rules and regulations are removed. The mandating of the separation of operations and infrastructure is an EU directive. We have the opportunity going forward, should we choose to change that, because the ability to change those laws will now with our own parliament here in London, and if we want to make real progress in that area, we can do it and we should do it, in my opinion.
Thanks, Chris. I'm going to let others come in here. Yep. Mary, do you have a view on this?
My view at the moment is the way that the regions have been split up into 5 is actually the better entity from an infrastructure perspective. This is a hugely complex area. And as a past operator, I would be wanting to be entrusted to all of a sudden go and start running the infrastructure. So I don't think that model is required. I think there's much better things we can do with actually bringing entities together to give a much better passenger service back and better value back to the taxpayer.
Mark?
It is complex, as Mary has said, and not many organisations have the balance sheet strength to take on the risk of infrastructure issues and infrastructure failures. And so it isn't just a point about somebody making short-term decisions. It's about whether they're prepared to take the long-term risk. And I think at the moment that's probably best placed in those that are expertise in that area.
Chris, as Minister?
All the experts tell me that you need to bring train and track together. So whether you do that in regions or whether you do that down lines or whatever, I think is definitely a direction of travel.
Well, thank you very much, Mary Grant, Chris Heaton-Harris, Chris Loder, Mark Phillips. Thank you for being such great panelists. We discussed a range of issues today, integration of operations and infrastructure. We talked about the climate change agenda. We talked about some of the new technology. We talked about some of the challenges getting passengers back on trains post-COVID. We talked about greater accessibility, all within an hour. Who would have believed it? Just shows what amazing people you all are. Can I also thank RSSB for their support of this webinar? Can I thank all the viewers for tuning in? If you enjoy this, even if you didn't enjoy it, but you want to tune in tomorrow morning, Think Tent will be hosting a webinar on BBC and Channel 4, What Next for State Broadcasters, with Martin Durkin, Philip Booth, Andrea Jenkins MP, Duncan Simpson, and the Right Honourable John Whittendale MP, starting at 9 a.m. You can watch via the Think Tent YouTube channel at www.thinktent.co.uk. It is what it says on the URL. Thank you all very much for joining us this evening. I'll let you go off. I'm going to be early. That's a lesson you can learn in the rail industry, isn't it? I'll let you off. I'll let you all be early for your next event. Thank you very much, and I hope very much to see you all again soon. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.